Hello everybody, welcome to Spain Awesome. My name is Eric, and welcome to a new series on the channel called Really? And in this series, it's really much like I guess a less shortened version of the podcast we do, where we try to focus on one story that came out in the news or something that was talked about a lot, something popular, and we kind of discuss it and kind of take our own point of view on it, and maybe how that sheds a light on much larger historical process or type of event. So for today, I'm joined by two guests. We're joined by Ben, who you guys have seen on the channel a lot over the time, and we have Daniel back on from the last podcast. He cannot, his voice is not so well, but he'll be in the chat helping us out. And yeah, so that's the crew for today. And for today's story, we're going to be looking at the Whitechapel murders. So that may seem random, but if you guys were checking on the news recently, there was this news story that came out to where new DNA evidence had come out and supposedly had found who the actual murder victim was, who murdered those 5 women in 1880.
Not the victim, the murderer.
Oh, so yeah, sorry. So the person they actually found the murderer who murdered 5 victims. So must spoke on that, but that's why you have Ben making sure we're all straight and narrow. So, so that's what we're talking about today, and then we're gonna see if this actually helps us historically kind of point to who the murderer was, or were there other types of ways in which this murder was actually found. So we'll be discussing it. So again, we'll kind of provide a little bit of our background just to let you know who's talking. So again, my name's Eric. So my focus is mainly on history, mainly 19th century history, which is something I like, 18th century history. But for me, it's like warfare, anything with on that lines, and also counterinsurgency. We have Ben, tell everybody what you do and what makes you so special.
I'm a genetics major. I specialize in human genetics, and no, nothing with murders or war or anything. I'm here for the genetic side.
And yeah, so Ben will be amazing resource for that and help us walk through that. And now Daniel is typing something. We'll see what he says.
Typing something could be very long or short.
Okay, so yeah, Daniel says he's a history major focusing on the U.S. and political science. And he'll be helping me out and making sure I'm staying everything right historically. Perfect. Okay, so let's actually dive into the story. So if we can kind of dive into the story, Ben, let us know what happened with the story and why is it so special what we're talking about?
Well, so as it turns out, some researchers were trying to look more into the murder, and what they did is they took a shawl that was on one of the murder victims, and they took some samples. I don't have the full article, but Daniel does. I have an abstract. My understanding was they took samples from some kind of stain. It sounded like it was blood, but I can't say. It just says relevant stains. They took cells from those stains, and they did a whole bunch of tests on them, including doing, I think, genotyping. And then they looked at what the DNA told them about the person. So what hair color would they have, what eye color, what kind of general size and shape would they be. They just called it the phenotypic information. And they compared that to what they called the only relevant witness information. And I guess based on that information, it points toward a barber whose name was, what was his name?
Some Polish dude.
Yeah, it was a Polish barber.
And Aaron Kominski. He was a 23-year-old Polish barber and prime suspect at the time. And
gotcha.
Daniel says it was from Catherine Edones, it was her shawl. It was victim number 2 in the Whitechapel killings.
Mm.
So that is the person who it was. Ben, anything else to add that we should know important from this new piece of evidence?
Nothing too relevant. They did a good number of different tests. They looked at the mitochondria data and the Y chromosome in order to get sort of a haplotype group and also the Y group to use that as further confirmation that they think it was this person. Beyond that, that's kind of all you need to know. They ran a bunch of tests, and their conclusion was it seemed to point toward this person.
Yes. And I think one of the reasons why this story kind of came out was kind of new is that, as we all know, these murders and the Whitechapel murders, and I think also Jack the Ripper is a story that's kind of like been told a lot of times, and it's like a very legendary case that has never been solved. And so with this new scientific evidence that's like actually real and not like people finding a book somewhere or like some weird other evidence, but actual real scientific, like something that can be based in science in a sense. And so with this piece of new evidence, it's something that we can actually use and actually kind of try to understand. So that's kind of reasons why this story kind of came out. Um, so we can just kind of talk about it. I guess let's just kind of go over what's the why. So actually, before we go there, let's kind of talk about why people don't think this was the case. So the reason why people don't think it's the case is because mainly because so according to Richard Cobb, who was another expert who runs the Jack the Ripper Convention and Tours, told the Times that the shawl could have been touched by many people over the years, which would have made the DNA samples less reliable. So, but I think before we kind of go into talking about why that could or could not be the case, I think it's be a good idea to kind of go over what happened and what happened during the murders. So basically, these occurred. There's actually 5 murders, I believe, right? 5.
At least 5.
At least 5. So basically, in around September, the first one was September 10th, 1888, in this area of Whitechapel, which was notoriously like a very impoverished area and place where lots of crime and prostitution occurred. Basically, some person or group of people, whoever it was, decided to murder 5 prostitutes, pretty much. And
Yeah, it's up to 11, but I think it was like they think that at least 4 or 5 of them were for sure the same killer.
Yes. So basically, these all occurred within about a month or so around each other, and
Daniel says 5 that are believed to be the same person. The rest seem to be copycats.
Yes,
People who are
basically copycatting it. So basically, at the same time these murders are occurring, these letters are being sent but to the police from somebody who called themselves Jack the Ripper. And basically the way in which he murdered victims is basically using a knife and cutting these women up to pieces pretty much, and would just basically mutilate them and disembowel them, removing organs such as kidneys and uteruses. And his crimes seem to portray an abhorrence to the entire female gender, according to History Channel's overview of the story of the murders, at least. So basically, what began to happen is that around the fall of 1888, the citizens, before we go into that, since these murders occurred to prostitutes, which was not really considered a crime within England, and was only considered a crime if, at least according to History Channel, looking for the word, if it only had caused a public disturbance, and since the prostitution was only legal if the practice had caused a public disturbance. And of course, during the 19th century, there was lots of brothels in low-rent lodging areas, and even going beyond that, just prostitution in general has always been like a job that's been very prevalent.
An ever-prevalent trade.
And especially for women, was a decent source of revenue for women who were in those types of predicaments, who are either were either not single, but like they've had children out of wedlock and they need some sort of income, or they've basically had a marriage and they basically couldn't get anything out of the divorce, maybe the divorce, and also maybe the death of the husband. Just different ways in which women kind of are poor and don't have any other ways of achieving anything substantial financially. It was a really good way for them to find those things. And then Daniel says they did have large numbers of male prostitutions for female and male clientele, which I would not be surprised if that was the case. That wouldn't make sense to me. But I would say that I would think female prostitution was a lot more prevalent, though. I think that would make sense, right, Daniel?
See what Daniel says.
Waiting for Daniel's response. Daniel is typing. Very much so, but the number of male prostitutes were rather unknown due to the illegality of homosexuality and the like. Yeah, your Jeopardy like that. Yes, it was. But yeah, so I mean, I think that's kind of a good to kind of bring it more to context. It wasn't just women, and men. But yes, women were a lot more prevalent during this time. So again, prostitution was a very prevalent activity for women during this time or during the past, maybe even to today now. I would still say the same thing. But kind of continuing going on, basically what happened is that after the murders suddenly stopped in the fall of 1880, Londoners continued to demand answers that would not come. And like I said before, these things become more. The story become more famous, and different rumors of who did or who committed murders and who did not. And to make things even more interesting, before this was not considered during the time when the murders were actually going on. It was not actually seen as like something amazing or important that should be actually focused on, because these women were prostitutes, and a lot of the times these women were kind of seen as like something you shouldn't really care about really because of their low status and their trade in which they apply to. But again, the way how these murders occurred and how they couldn't find it kind of became prevalent. There's been many types of people who've been accused of being the murderer, even a grandson of Queen Victoria. I don't know. I think they tell me which grandson. Nope, they don't.
The
The grandson. But yeah, that's kind of what's kind of going on and why this news story has been kind of brought into the fold. So I guess we can go back to this DNA. I guess this way in which they're looking at this analysis. So Ben, would you kind of when look at how Robert Cobb, what do you think of when he says that that this DNA sample could have been diluted because of the amount of people who touched the Shaw, or anything like that? What's your opinion on that, and could that be a possibility?
So the way that they did the sequencing is they actually use single cells, meaning that they take a sample and then out of that entire sample they take like singular cells out of it, and then they sequenced those. And based on the article, since I didn't get to read the full like actual scientific article, based on the news article, it sounded like they compared the mitochondrial group. Wait, how would that make sense? I just realized. So it says that they compared fragments of mitochondrial DNA to samples. Okay, it could work. So they compared the mitochondrial DNA of the person to his known living relatives, which I'm assuming they did this correctly. The mitochondria is usually only inherited from the mother, meaning he would have to have like a sister or some kind of family line that's only women, leading to the modern day. And if those are a perfect match, then it would be pretty likely that this Polish man living in London, there's not going to be very many other relatives who are going to have the exact same maternal haplogroup. Mm-hmm. So based on the way that they did it, contamination wouldn't so much be a problem. Random chance would probably have a bigger role in that than anything.
And then Daniel was responding to my question. It was Prince Albert Victor, the Duke of Clarence and whatever that says.
Avon, yeah.
Yeah. But I think what kind of what's the word? What kind of makes this, I guess, a lot more like possible is the fact that it was found on somebody who was actually considered to be a prime suspect. Now, if we kind of look at why he was considered to be a prime suspect, so supposedly the reason why this person named Aaron Kominsky, the reason why he's considered to be one of the Whitechapel, like one of the suspects pretty much, is because, he was basically a Polish Jew who immigrated to England during this time. And supposedly one of the pieces of evidence was that there was a memorandum written by one of the chief constables of the London Metropolitan Police, who named him one of the suspects without a forename. His name was Kominsky. He had no forename, so he had no first name essentially. And in the memo that was found in the private papers by his daughter that was released to the public in the 70s, he had stated that there were strong reasons of suspecting Kominsky because he had a great hatred of women, and he had strong homicidal tendencies. And in 1910, Sir Robert Anderson, who was the assistant commissioner, said that the Ripper was a low-class Polish Jew. And I'm trying to go back. It says the Chief Inspector Donald Swanson, who led the Ripper investigation, named the man as Kaminsky in handwritten notes in the margin of his presentation copy of Anderson's memoirs. He added that Kaminsky had been watched at his brother's home in Whitechapel by police, and that he was taken with his hands tied behind his back to the workhouse and the Coley Hatches Asylum, and that he died shortly after, whereas Aaron Kaminsky had not died until 1910. So basically, I guess what they're saying is that Anderson claimed that Ripper has only been identified as the only person who has ever had a good view of the murderer. But no prosecution was made possible because both witnesses and the culprit were Jews, and Jews were not willing to offer testimonies against fellow Jews. That is interesting.
It is.
So basically, the reason why they kind of pointed to this person is because he already had like a suspected kind of mental problem against women in a sense, or at least that's what they believed. And then the fact that he had actually lived in the area for a certain amount of time, it said that, at least according to the Wikipedia article, which I'm not sure if you can trust, but we're just getting basic information. Really. Yeah, it said that Kaminsky had been watched at his brother's home in Whitechapel by police, and that he was taken with his hands tied behind his workhouse in the Coley's Hedge Asylum, and then died shortly after. So this person had been living in Whitechapel, and then they believed that he already had an already kind of mental disease, and so that's why he was kind of considered the victim. But of course, this was before they had actual fingerprint evidence, pretty much, so they couldn't actually get.
Yeah, they had basically no forensics at the time.
Yeah, and according to at least the Wikipedia article, they're saying that there could have been people could have told that it was this person or not, but since I guess the Jewish community was very close at that time, maybe even till today, that they would not want to basically not confess, but basically tell on another Jew essentially. So that is really interesting though. But I'm kind of thinking about it, right? So taking all this together, we already have a person who was already considered to be a prime suspect, right? And then we have this DNA that's kind of, basically could point to him already looking at him already being the supposed criminal or the person who did the deed. I would say that I guess it's a lot better evidence than what we've had before. And then Ben, you were asking what type of things was on it. It was stained with blood and semen.
Yeah, I saw that when I was trying to find his name.
And it was the killer's fourth victim. So, with that all together, what do you think, Ben? Would you think the same way that I'm thinking, or do you think the DNA could probably be scrambled with all the different people handling it and things like that?
Well, like I said, if it were... So they ran numerous different types of tests on it. So one of the things they did was genotyping, or what it sounds like they did genotyping, which is basically, think 23andMe, where they do like, here's a bunch of little snips. Based on that data, we're going to get things like eye color and hair color and just general features. If they just did that, I would say it probably wouldn't mean much. Mm-hmm. But based on the using the mitochondrial DNA, matching it to current living relatives, I think that definitely narrows the possibilities. Mm-hmm. Where it's possible that they just completely got the wrong person, but there's only so many people that'll share the exact same mitochondrial maternal haplogroup as you.
Yeah.
So it's possible, but I think it's pretty strong evidence.
I would say so too, because I'm thinking about, because when I was reading it the first time, I was thinking it could have been had like multiple people who could have done it because it's a strong possibility. But I'm not sure, because I feel like people would do. This is me just taking a wild guess and speculation, but I think those types of things happen more if it's kind of like reported on and made important. You know what I'm saying? Like,
Yeah, it was
because
very sensationalized in the newspapers at the time.
and then Dan, you can check this out, but correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think this was like when it was actually happening, right? It wasn't like a huge big deal until like the fifth or sixth one, right? I think that's what it was, at least according to me. So I think from
Yeah.
that point of
Well,
view,
the
yeah,
other thing
go.
to consider, as far as if it were multiple people or only one, is that the DNA evidence that we have is only from one article of clothing from one victim.
Yeah,
So it doesn't mean anything for all the other murders.
good point. Good point. So so that's kind of what I was thinking on that. But I think a good thing to kind of if Daniel's check on that, good on him. Um, but the thing I kind of want to talk about is kind of like, I guess kind of like why should people care about this just besides like the murder, like the larger kind of context of kind of looking at these things. And I think the first thing I kind of found when I'm thinking about it is just kind of like how we kind of look at poverty and kind of how we look at like, basically how we look at these types of people who get affected by things. And we kind of already talked about it before about how, um, I guess the first thing we kind of talk about is just like the development of just kind of criminal, like, what's it called, like criminal justice and like kind of the history of it in a sense, and also maybe
Mhm.
about poverty and kind of how, basically how that was occurring during this time. In the 1880s, you're still in the Industrial Revolution. You're still in the time where, you know, socialism and like communism, these types of things are starting to come more into our view, essentially. With the even though that the Communist Manifesto has already been published by Karl Marx, I believe in 1841, I believe that's the date. Um, but especially like in Russia and especially like in other places, especially in the Commune, with Paris happening in the 1870s, like those ideas are becoming a lot more prevalent. And the reason why these things, and the reason why, it's not really surprising that, you know, like basically it's not only until like a couple, maybe 10, 20 years after these murders. Not saying there's a clear correlation essentially,
Mhm.
but that it's not no surprise that basically you have the rise of basically the USSR is formed in 1918. It's like only like 30 years from this from this point of view or so, and just
Mhm.
this either ideas start to become more prevalent throughout Eastern Europe and other places. If it's because it's a really much a response to like the type of places such as Whitechapel, which is a very impoverished area, which I oh, it's but hold on, Daniel is reporting in. Due to the sheer brutality of the cases, that they immediately drew attention and the fear from people, the letters only exacerbated the fact. Okay, that makes sense.
So it was sensationalized from the beginning, and then it got more extreme as the supposed killer sent in notes.
Yeah. So yeah, but just kind of go back to what I was talking about. It's because like if you think about it, like, oh yeah, most definitely. He says that he's let's just pull it up so everyone can see. Yeah, so Daniel says that I'm certain the copycats added further to the fear as well. Yeah, I would think so too. I mean, once those things kind of kick off. Um,
Yeah.
yeah. So, but kind of like basically this type of setting was not really. I don't think it was very kind of. Um, it was not a setting that you were. It's not a setting that did not was not rare. I guess I was trying to say, especially in
Mm.
London or maybe other parts in Europe, because you're in the midst of the Industrial Revolution. You already have like if you think about the immigrants coming from Ireland to New York. If you think about how like you have all these people living in impoverished areas and like you like five people or six people living like in a small home, which still happens today, but it was a lot more prevalent, especially during this time with a lot of immigrants coming through. And
Mhm.
even enough, like speaking of, we have this Aaron Kominsky who was, you know, someone who's already considered a victim or a suspect in a sense. But I think another reason why probably that he couldn't been more considered a suspect was because not only was he a foreigner, he was Polish, right? And
Mhm.
he was a Jew, which is like a double like two terrible things essentially. Like not only are you an immigrant and you're coming to like a very impoverished area, but you're also considered a Jew, which sadly was something that was looked down upon during that time. Um, so I think it probably made it easier for that type of person to be considered the victim already, essentially. A
Suspect, not victim.
suspect. I'm sorry, suspect. My bad, guys.
Opposite of that.
Suspect. Um, but I'm not saying that he probably could have still done it though, right? Because we're saying before that there's evidence that shows that he was involved, right? That's what we're saying, or at least that's what the article's saying.
Yeah, it definitely looks like there's supporting evidence for it being him. Yeah.
Yeah. So but I'm not saying that he didn't do it or not, but I think that it's just like it shows kind of the area that was there. I mean, you're an area where there's a lot of immigrants, and it's kind of a reflection on kind of what was going on during that time. If you kind of think about it, actually, you had a lot of like people from Eastern Europe and Southern Europe kind of coming around because like a lot of Italians coming from, from Italy going to New York, things like that. Of course, you had the Irish, but that was probably a little bit earlier with the potato famine in the 1840s or so. But I guess what I'm trying to say is that during this time in the late 19th century, these areas existed a lot, especially in urban areas, because of with the introduction of the Industrial Revolution, and basically having the work only being in these cities, essentially. So if you want to work and find work, you have to go to cities, and these cities start to pile up more and more. And already, people are not getting paid to their fair share because, basically like the market kind of drives how factory owners kind of do their things. And so with those combinations, you basically have settings such as this. And kind of speaking on to that, kind of like, I guess in terms of criminal like history in a sense, I was reading something very interesting that I found. It kind of speaks to it. So this was a study done by the, it says, okay. So I think it's a bunch of people, so it's not just one person. So this comes from a study that was done on basically the development of homicides and in cities and something like that. And so what they found actually, which I thought was really interesting, this was people who comment on this was John McCord, a professor of criminal justice at Temple University, and Eric H. McCon, a professor of American urban history at University of California. And so what they believe is that there's really been a civilizing process. So what they found is that scholars say that as state power kind of increased in the beginning of the 16th and 17th century, it supposedly helped to curb impulsive and violent behavior. And they point to a couple of things. So one of the things they point to is the fact that you had, let's try to look. So they kind of talk about how the first research on homicide rates was reported more than a decade ago by historians studying England. Scholars doubt its accuracy since it's relied on old coroners. In recent years, critics have focused on population-based used to calculate homicide rates, precisely how people were living in England in the 1400s, for example. So basically, it's like based on like a percentage. Like, is there more people dying out of like 1,300 people? What's the percentage essentially? And they compare that to our days, essentially. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay.
Following you so far.
So they've done this research in many different countries: United States, Australia, England, France, Italy, and the Netherlands. And so basically what they found is that, for example, new data presented at the conference by Dutch scholar Pieter Speenberg showed that homicide rates in Amsterdam, for example, dropped from 47 per 100,000 people in the mid-15th century. Dropped from 47 per 100,000 people in the mid-15th century to 1 to 1.5 per 100,000 in the early 19th century. That's crazy. That's a huge difference.
Yeah, seriously.
And so Professor Stone had estimated that the homicide rate in medieval England was on average 10 times that of the 20th century England. A study at the University of Oxford in the 1340s showed an extremely high annual rate of about 110 per 100,000 people. Studies of London in the first half of the 14th century determined a homicide rate of 36 to 52 per 100,000 people per year. So what they're showing is that as time goes on, you start to see a lot less homicides occurring.
Interesting.
And And so by contrast, the 1993 homicide rate in New York City was 25.9 100,000, and the 1992 national homicide rate for the United States was 9.3 per 100,000. And I think a lot of that probably is because of New York. You know, you had the drugs coming through and things like that.
Yeah.
And so basically, they point to the reason why why more people were murdered in the 14th, like basically before like the 16th century, where we start to see the state have more centralized powers. Especially if you look at like France with the trying to remember the group that lived there. Actually, it really doesn't matter. But basically, you have states start to centralize power and try to move away from that medieval thing where you have the nobles having lots of more rights, things like that, and basically the kings start to have more power, start to have more control over the state, pretty much. They find that murders start to go down, and so they kind of point to what happened in the past is the fact that, you know, it would be between farmers. Like basically, if you were pissed off at somebody, you just like, okay, you pissed me off, I'm gonna kill you because you pissed me off or whatever, or like a lack of like you hurt someone's honor, so you have like a duel or something like that. So yeah, they said that most slayings in medieval England started as quarrels among farmers in the field. They were grubbing for existence. Insults to honor were taken seriously, and violence was accepted. The method of settling disputes, since the king's courts were so slow, expensive, and corrupt. And so you have a lot of the knife and quarterstaff, the heavy wooden stick commonly carried for herding animals, were used as like weapons pretty much, and even like everyone carried a knife, even women. So basically, you bring a weapon because you don't know what's going to happen. So basically,
and this was during medieval time?
This is during medieval times.
Okay.
And so the most widely accepted explanation of why this happens is because comes from the work of Norbert Elias, a sociologist who in the late 1930s introduced the idea of a civilizing process in which the nobility was transformed from knights into courtiers, bringing in a new set of manners, and the modern state spread its power over the populace. Official justice administered by courts replaced private vengeance conducted by feuds, fights, and duels. Challenging conventional academic wisdom, Mr. Elias suggested too that the power of the state expand to the cities first, so urban homicide rates would be comparatively low. And so what they show more is more evidence of how these homicide rates go lower and lower. In Philadelphia, for example, the annual average rate of indictments for homicide fell from 4 per 100,000 in the 1850s to 2.2 in the early 1890s, according to research by Roger Lane, a history professor at the Harvard College.
Wow.
And so
apparently the homicide rates kept going down until the 1960s when it shot back up. So they think it's the boomers' fault.
Yeah. But I think what they're kind of arguing is that, like, basically, even though, like, I think we can kind of tie it into this, is that, like, even though, like, these murders, bloody boomers, yes, Daniel. Yeah, I feel like Daniel's, like, the god who speaks when like, it's important to speak. He brings forth the knowledge from the heavens. What was I saying? Oh, so I think the biggest thing is that we kind of connect all these things together is the fact that even though these I keep saying bloody boomers. He just says he liked it. Okay, I think the way in which we can kind of connect these two stories is that even though that these murders were very like violent, and my prophet knows, even though these murders are very violent and like super like, you know, basically when you think of like crime in like this 19th century or just crime in general, you think of like the White Castle murders. Okay, yeah, I thought never mind. Even though that was the case, there's been evidence that shows that actually, as time kind of goes on, like less and less actual homicides actually occur. And according to these people, according to these researchers, a lot of them kind of believe it's the increase of state power that basically, I guess, kind of stop these murders from occurring. And I think a lot of it comes from like basically if you want to deal with somebody in a kind of more civilized fashion sense, you go to court, and like basically the state also gets a lot more reliable. Essentially, it's a lot more, you can get things done, things like that. And And so I think the last thing I'll kind of talk about this is that I forgot the last this part. This is the last part I think is kind of interesting. As people begin to go to work in factories, their behavior was constrained by the foreman and the whistle. Professor Lane has written, behavior will also improve by the spread of public schools, which acted as agents of social control, and institutions like the YMCA and Sunday schools, which taught morality. Similar developments helped lower New Yorkers' homicide rates in the late 19th century and early 20th century. And of course, like you said, in the 1960s, homicide rates did about a face when Kennedy was murdered, and basically people just started getting murdered left and right. 4 point in 1963, for example, the national homicide rate in the United States was 4.6 per 100,000 people, and by 1970 it had doubled. In 1980s, it reached 10.1 per 100,000 people. And they say, oh, okay, and they believe it's because of more young men who are the most violent prone group, to basically increase this idea. And also it was a distrust of the system as well, of the state, because of the Vietnam War and things like that. So Ben, what do you kind of think of what they're kind of saying on that note? What's your kind of...
Well, that last part sounds kind of confusing. It's like baby boomers come of age, increasing the number of young men, but that also increased the number of everyone. Anyway, that seems kind of weird, but yeah, I think the general concept is very interesting. The idea that as a group or as a town or as a city becomes more centralized, more civilized, number of murders goes down. I think it's very interesting.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. It's kind of more sociology than anything.
But the one thing the report's very interesting, but I think what it fails to do, and I don't think they really talk about it in this article, is how much crime plays into, or crime or even economics. How does those things play into, murder essentially?
How does economics play into crime?
Crime, essentially, right? Because if we look at the White Castle, the White Castle murders, right? These murders occurred in very poverty-stricken areas, like these really brutal. And like if you look at basically look at murders in general, a lot of them happen in poverty-stricken areas. Like if you look at areas in Detroit or Chicago, where a lot of those things, where there's a lot of, I think it's just any urban city, you're gonna have those types of areas. That's where you see a lot more crime. That's where you see a lot more criminal activity, and that's where you also see a lot more opportunities for violence.
That makes sense.
Which I'm surprised that this thing does not kind of cover. And then Dan, if you want to if the prophet wants to type anything, let us know.
Well, I'd say on the other hand, though, the 1960s were a fairly prosperous time economically in America, wasn't it?
Yes, it was.
So you wouldn't really expect it. You would expect during the Great Depression for murder rates to spike, but based on what we're reading, it sounds like that didn't happen. It sounds like during the Great Depression, it kind of stayed, relatively normal. And then in the 60s, during this era of great prosperity, suddenly it started spiking. So that would be kind of a counterpoint to the economics thing. So it'd just be, it could just be kind of, there was something else going on where economics maybe does tend to trend with crime, but maybe outside factors matter too. Because like you said, when crime in New York was spiking, it was because of kind of a huge drug epidemic.
Yes, with the it wasn't crack, it was
meth.
Meth, there we go. Or just any type of illegal substances.
Well, any type of severe ones.
Or anything that pays a lot of money. So Daniel believes the Great Depression may have seen less murders due to the sharp increases of suicide rates at the time.
It's possible. I don't really know enough about the era.
I don't know. I would have to see kind of the statistics on that. Yeah, I wouldn't know for that.
We're all just speculating.
Yeah, we're all just speculating on that one. But that's just kind of how I kind of view crime in a sense, or at least, if I was to kind of correlate those two ideas in terms of homicides, or at least the increase of homicides, I would say that it mainly occurs in these poverty.
You think it tends to be economically motivated?
I don't think it's economically motivated. I just think that those things kind of follow each other, essentially. How like you have a lot of crime and you have like a lot of stealing. Basically, people getting mugged. People like, or I guess like drug like in England, for example. Have you guys heard of like Peaky Blinders, for example? The show
No.
where you have like a lot of these gangs striving control over these neighborhoods in these
Hmm.
areas. Have you played like Assassin's Creed, the new one, not the new one, but the one that took place in England?
The London one. Yeah, I think I did.
Yeah, like how you had different groups kind of sort of over control for these neighborhoods,
Sure.
which has kind of occurred in many different areas, even like in the Renaissance where you had like remember it wasn't like remember what was the trying to think, the play by Shakespeare. You had the two
Romeo and
families,
Juliet.
Romeo and Juliet, or like we had these two families vying over control.
What was it? The Capulets and the
The Montesquieu's? No, that's not them.
Montagues.
Montagues. But
Yes, Montagues.
there we go. And like, so I mean, that's kind of when I kind of look at crime and just things like that. That's how I kind of have it. But this kind of look at, like, I guess the state power being tied to the lessening of criminal activity, which is really interesting. But if you also think about it too, just having state power doesn't automatically make things better. It could actually make things worse. Like if you think about like the war on drugs, for example, in the 1980s, of how like you now had a lot more, incarcerations for drug-related activities,
Hmm.
millions of dollars spent to fighting these drugs, and now since these drugs are legal, it creates like a kind of a base to kind of make money for these people, kind of under the radar, and it creates like a more of a criminal system in these poverty-stricken areas. And so, but I think, I think that's kind of what I was probably going to say real quickly. Um, but yeah, that's how I kind of see, like, I guess the correlation between poverty and kind of more homicides. But kind of looking at this, I think provides a really interesting look at how else you can kind of look at these kind of. But they also provide really good evidence. You can definitely see the decrease of homicides occurring, and they provide some good evidence. So not hurting about
Yeah,
that.
it's definitely interesting.
Yeah. But yeah. So I guess we can kind of end it here. I think the thing we can kind of end is just kind of let's kind of overview what we kind of thought about really. I think what I really think is I kind of agree with the evidence that was found by the scientists essentially, because we have someone who's already considered a suspect, and we already have um, very strong, or at least a lot stronger DNA, or what's it called? What type of evidence we're looking at again? Physical evidence of who actually committed the murders. But we cannot say if it actually was the person because it's only from one person and we can't actually connect it. But
Yeah.
it's a lot stronger than before. And then when it comes to the fact that anything you want to say on that?
I'll say yeah. It's a new piece of evidence that we've just never been able to see before.
We talk about the chances of it being diluted, or the DNA being diluted. Ben, you would say that the chances of that are a lot lower because of the types of tests that they did and like the way in which they actually conducted the tests. You'd
Yeah,
say?
I think the results of the mitochondrial tests kind of point to that not being the case.
And I also think that if basically like if the Shaw was already kind of the DNA evidence was already connected to a dude who was already kind of considered to be a suspect, I don't see that how that could also mess it up too. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, well, I don't think the DNA evidence specifically was connected to him at the time.
Hmm.
It was an eyewitness account and some other small things.
Yeah.
The DNA evidence was more just kind of there, which is why it was sold to some woman who ended up giving it to the researchers.
But I think but the DNA evidence did connect to somebody who was already considered a suspect, though, right?
Yes.
Yes.
But only now that the research has been done.
Yeah. So I think with those two things.
Oh, I never mind. I see what you're saying. Okay, yes.
Yeah. So I think with those two things together, I think we could say that it's a lot possible that this person could have been the Jack the Ripper, or at least one of the people who was connected, or at least copycatted it, or maybe knew somebody who did it you want to copy that person or whatever it was.
Mm-hmm.
I think we have, and I think at the same time, the story also gives insight into what was kind of going on during this time in history, where you have, this event takes place in a time where you have lots of urban areas where they're very poverty stricken with the introduction of the Industrial Revolution, and you have a lot of immigrants coming from different countries, like from Eastern Europe or the United States. You have Italians go to New York. Have you guys seen the show The Alienist? It's a good show. I would definitely check it out. It kind of follows the same type of thing, but you can kind of see how like this is kind of a new kind of new wave of kind of urban transforming, these Western European countries, or at least England or America, for example. And so you get that type of sense. But even though that these murders may point to a time where these things always occurred, or it was always like this in a sense, there's been evidence that shows that murders as a whole from the medieval times going down, that murders have been occurring less and less and less. And if you saw
Yeah.
the numbers that I showed you, you can definitely see
Mm-hmm.
that as being the case. The reason why, at least according to this, is because of the increase of state power, meaning there's less need to solve things by yourself, like duels or things like that. Like I said before, I feel like there's something else that can be argued against it, with in terms of, um, how does economics kind of feed into the increase, either maybe like decrease in economics, or maybe finding new ways in which poverty and crime can kind of explode or increase. Even though that there's been some type of, just because there's like drugs or whatever, doesn't mean that crime isn't always going to find a new way to make money. Essentially, like there's always something that's, crime's always going to be there essentially, and it's just whatever they're going to sell, not export, but smuggle in and out. There's always
Yeah.
something there. But I would like to see how economics also plays into that as well, which would be interesting to see. Probably story for another time. And
Yeah.
but yeah, that's kind of how I kind of see it, and I think how we can all kind of look at the time period as well, and get more of it than just a sensational killer, and more like a preview into what was going on during that time, and also the role of women too, as prostitutes has always been a source of revenue for women who were in those predicaments who didn't have ways of making money as well, in a more, I guess, less reasonable way, I guess you can say, for less like better word. So that's kind of all I have to say on it. Daniel, sorry, Ben, what do you have to kind of take on it? And then Daniel, you can write what you kind of think about this, your final thoughts as well.
Well, I mean, I was just kind of here for the DNA. I think it's definitely not a conclusive thing, since it's such an old case.
Mm-hmm.
But it definitely shines a new light and just provides new evidence that we never would have been able to get any time in the past. And it's just very interesting how, as this technology progresses, we're going to be able to kind of figure out more and more things, and maybe even solve more cold cases that you never would have thought we could actually try to figure out anymore.
Mm-hmm. What does the prophet Daniel have for us? So according to Daniel, he believes it is interesting, but we have to keep in mind that it is inclusive and does not prove that he killed her or the others. It does look damning for him, but we'll have to see. For those who are interested, they use similar methods to find that Anastasia was dead. If you guys don't know who Anastasia was, she was one of the members of the Romanov family who, I think it was Alexander the Second, I believe. I'm not sure.
The last of the Romanovs.
The last of the Romanovs. And supposedly they thought that she actually survived the time when her family was murdered by the Bolsheviks, I believe. Yeah, the Bolsheviks. In the Red House. And so they had thought it was a couple of women who could have been here, and that she had thought to escape, but, yeah. So they,
Yeah.
so basically they used DNA evidence to figure out that it wasn't, that she was actually dead. And I think they looked at her bones or something like that. I forget what it was, but they used DNA. And yes, Tsar Alexander Romanov of Russia, so the first Alexander, was killed by Bolshevik secret police. Yes, and bones in a mass grave was where they were found.
Interesting. I didn't know that part.
So yeah, no, DNA evidence, especially for like, just figuring out things what happened in the past, or like understanding what happened in the past, and even like just like basically what people like ate, what was their dietary, just science in general has helped us understand the past a lot more, and without it, it'd be a lot harder to figure things out. And so, even though science is kind of like weird for us historians, like we're not really sure on it, it's really, yeah. What were you gonna say?
So you were trying to integrate science into one of your graduate school applications.
Yeah. What I'm trying to say is that it's not like it's a thing that's kind of taken on a new light. Essentially, it's something that's become a lot more, like, popular in history. Essentially,
DNA is taking over all the fields.
Exactly. So Ben, we might need you to come to this side. Ben's like, no, I'm staying on my side.
So you can take a few genetics classes. You'll be fine.
No, all I know is what's it called, the what's the square, the Punnett square.
Hey, you got its name.
That's as far as I go with DNA.
Do you actually know how to use it? Or you just know its name?
I used to. I was like, oh, I got this genetics class, and then that's the only thing I got. And everybody was like, I don't know what's going on. I just got my Punnett square. Just before we end, how much is that, like, in terms of knowledge? Like, is that like 5% of like DNA knowledge, or if you're doing genetics, just having that?
I would say knowing the Punnett square is equivalent to. Trying to think, is equivalent to being able to like name the 13 colonies and knowing nothing else about history.
I think I'll just stay in my lane. I'll let you deal with the genetics. So hope you guys enjoyed this episode of Really. Hope you guys got some really good insight into history, and also a little bit of cool little facts on what happened in the past and why things are being talked about, and hopefully maybe even we discovered who the real person was who actually committed these murders. We never know. But yeah, so join us back on the next episode of Really, where we talk about the Nazis. So that's always a fun topic. So we guys stay tuned for that, and we'll see you guys the next time.
We're gonna weave some Nazis. Stay tuned.
Nazis and Brexit. That's the next episode. Just kidding. So see you guys later. Please subscribe, like the video, share it to your friends, your mom, your dad, your dog, your sheep, whatever you have. And we'll see you guys in the next one. Peace out.
See ya.